The night air in Louisiana felt like silk, warm and thick, humming with the lazy buzz of distant cicadas. The moon hung low, casting pale silver light across the moss-draped trees lining the narrow road that led to the funeral home. It was the kind of night that should have felt peaceful, the kind where a breeze would gently rustle the leaves and soothe a tired soul. But that night was different. Something in the air was off. I couldn't place it. The wind wasn't just whispering, it was murmuring, like it carried secrets too old to be spoken aloud. When I took the job, I wasn't looking for excitement. I just needed something steady, a paycheck, some quiet, maybe a chance to reset. My last job in Baton Rouge had ended badly. Too many hours, too little sleep, and a mistake that left a deep scar on my reputation. When the listing for a groundskeeper and night assistant at the Thibodeau funeral home popped up online, I almost didn't apply. But the pay was solid, the duties simple, and best of all, it was far away from anyone who knew me. A fresh start, wrapped in silence. Or so I thought. The place stood at the edge of a sleepy town few had heard of, the kind of town with one gas station, a diner with faded menus, and streets where your footsteps echoed even in the daylight. The funeral home itself was a grand old building, Victorian architecture with weathered brick, towering windows, and wrought iron gates that groaned when they opened. The sign outside, Thibodeau's and Sons, was slightly crooked, as if gravity was slowly winning a quiet battle against time. From the first step onto the gravel path, something felt heavy, not oppressive, just noticeable. The way the wind stopped as I approached, how the trees seemed to lean in ever so slightly, watching. Inside, the air was cold and clean, but laced with an old scent, earth, wax, and a faint trace of something smoky, like incense that had long since faded. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling, and portraits of unsmiling ancestors stared, down with eyes that followed you just a second too long. The carpet muffled my footsteps, but every once in a while I swore I heard a faint creak, like the boards remembered someone else walking here years before. Miss Evelyn Thibodeau greeted me at the door. Mid-60s, tightly pinned silver hair, a voice smooth like molasses, but firm like the edge of a blade. She wore black, not out of mourning, I realized, but because it was simply expected here. Tradition ran deep in the bones of this place. She looked me over once, twice, and handed me a slim envelope. "Your duties. Read it carefully." I waited until I was in the small room I'd be staying in, modest, with a twin bed, desk, and a single lamp that hummed when turned on, before opening it. The list inside wasn't long, but one line stood out, underlined 3 times. Never enter the viewing room after midnight. It didn't say why. No explanation, no warning, just the rule. I laughed at first. A funeral home with strange rules? Sure, probably just meant to scare off idiots who would wander into restricted areas. But something about how it was written, about how Evelyn handed it to me without blinking, made me pause. The days were quiet. I mowed the lawn, polished the railings, kept the floors clean, helped set up for the occasional memorial. Evelyn rarely spoke unless she had to, and I rarely needed to ask questions. But the nights, those were something else entirely. I started noticing the sounds first. At around 11 p.m., just as I'd be settling in with a book or lying on the bed staring at the cracked ceiling paint, I'd hear the faintest tapping. Not rhythmic, not mechanical, just a soft, irregular tap, tap, tap from down the hall. Once I crept out and peeked into the corridor, nothing. Just shadows clinging to the corners and the faint tick of the grandfather clock in the parlor. I told myself it was the pipes. Then came the smell. Not strong, not unpleasant exactly, just different, faintly floral, like lilies, but with something sour underneath. It would drift in and out, never staying long enough to track down. It reminded me of the scent that clings to funeral flowers, left too long in the heat. I mentioned it once to Evelyn. She looked at me for a long second, then said, "You'll get used to it." That was it. On my fifth night, I passed by the viewing room on my way to the kitchen. The door was cracked open, though I was sure I'd closed it earlier when I cleaned. Inside was pitch black. The overhead chandelier should have glowed with soft amber light. Motion sensors had been installed years ago, but tonight it didn't flicker on. Something about that darkness felt unnatural, like it swallowed light instead of waiting for it. I stood there for a full minute just listening. No sound, no wind, no ticking clock, just silence. Then, from inside, a low creak. Not loud, not sudden, just the sound of something moving slowly, deliberately. I shut the door. That night I dreamed of footsteps in water, slow, dragging footsteps. The next morning my shoes, tucked neatly under the bed, were damp. By now the whispers had started, just barely there, right at the edge of hearing. A soft hush of syllables I couldn't make out. Sometimes I thought it was Evelyn talking in her office, except her light would be off. Sometimes I thought it was the wind. But the wind didn't sound like voices saying your name. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a constant awareness, as though I wasn't alone, even when I clearly was. I asked Evelyn if there had been incidents. She gave me that same long, unreadable look. "This house has served the dead longer than we've been alive," she said. "Some things settle, some linger. Do you believe that? I believe in rules, and I believe in consequences." That night I walked the hall again. The viewing room door was closed. I stood in front of it for longer than I should have, listening. Nothing, but when I turned to leave, I caught movement in the reflection of the hallway mirror, a shape just past the door, still, watching. I didn't look back. The next morning, the rule in my envelope had changed. Same paper, same handwriting. Now it read, "Never open the door, not even if it knocks." And at the bottom, fresh ink, "You've been invited." The days passed slowly, as if time itself was hesitant to move too quickly inside the walls of Thibodeau Funeral Home. I settled into a quiet rhythm. Wake early, complete the day's tasks, nod respectfully to the few families that visited, then retreat into the uneasy calm of night. But with each passing evening, the house felt less like a place of rest and more like something alive, something breathing beneath the floorboards and watching through the glass. Outside, the grounds grew stranger. The fog rolled in thick after sunset, blanketing the gravel path and curling like fingers around the wrought iron gates. It wasn't natural mist. It moved too slowly, clinging to the earth like it didn't want to rise. Even the trees seemed caught in its web, their limbs frozen, skeletal, as though they too feared to move. Sometimes, when I stood at the porch just before midnight, I'd hear a soft shuffling on the path, the crunch of unseen footsteps. But when I looked, there was no one. Only the fog, dense and unwavering. The inside of the funeral home had its own character. The light fixtures, aged brass sconces and dangling chandeliers, flickered often, even though the wiring had been painted recently. It wasn't the chaotic flicker of faulty bulbs, but a gentle dimming, like someone was slowly turning a dial. One evening, while polishing the banister, the lights faded so softly I didn't notice until the hallway was nearly dark. And then, just as quietly, they returned. Evelyn said nothing about it. I took comfort in small routines, straightening the guest chairs in the viewing room, dusting the fireplace mantel, wiping the glass on the antique clocks that chimed softly. At the hour, but there was one clock, an old grandfather in the corner of the parlor that began ticking a second too slow. It was barely noticeable unless you listened for it. A dragging sound, like each second fought to exist. I tried to fix it once, adjusting the pendulum, resetting the time. But by morning, it had returned to its slow, deliberate rhythm. The longer I stayed, the more the house seemed to shift. Small changes. The framed portrait in the hallway, an oil painting of a boy holding a lantern, seemed off one day. His eyes looked slightly to the left instead of forward. I brushed it off. Maybe the frame had tilted, or the angle of light had changed. But the next day, the lantern in his hand looked dimmer. By the end of the week, it was barely visible. I told myself I was imagining it. Then came the sounds. They weren't loud. That's what made them unsettling. A faint echo, like someone whispering in another room, too distant to understand, but too close to ignore. Once while I cleaned the chapel, I heard laughter, soft, high-pitched, a child's giggle, quick and breathless. I dropped the cloth and turned, heart in my throat. Nothing. I searched the halls, even stepped outside into the fog. The grounds were empty. When I mentioned it to Evelyn, she stirred her tea once, twice, and said, "Children often find their way back to where they were loved last." I didn't ask what that meant. Doors began to behave strangely. The main office door would creak open, just an inch or two when I was sure I'd closed it. Once I found the back door unlatched and swinging slightly on its hinges, though the wind was still. I started locking every room before bed, double-checking each handle. Yet in the morning, one or two would always be ajar, as if the house had its own path to follow, regardless of mine. In my small room upstairs, the lamp began to hum louder each night. A low vibration just under the edge of hearing. I tried ignoring it, but it made sleep uneasy. I started dreaming of quiet halls, filled with fog, of voices behind doors I couldn't open. I woke more than once, with the feeling that someone had just left the room. My shoes were placed differently one morning. The characters of the house, those who came before, began to show themselves in subtle ways. A handprint on the mirror, too small to be mine. A comb moved on the dresser. A smell, lavender and smoke, drifting through my room, then disappearing. Evelyn remained silent on it all. She never flinched, never questioned. It was as if she knew the rhythm of the house and trusted it to keep its own order. "It's best not to interfere with old things," she told me once, while setting fresh candles in the chapel. "They have their ways. We just walk gently among them." I started walking more slowly through the halls, breathing quieter, listening more. I found myself whispering even when alone, as though afraid to disturb the stillness. The shadows stretched longer than they should have. The light took longer to return. One night I caught a glimpse of something in the hallway mirror. Just a flicker, a silhouette behind me standing still. When I turned, nothing, but I swear the air felt colder. The carpet beneath my feet damp. I didn't sleep that night. I began leaving offerings, small things, a bowl of water on the window sill, a single white rose on the parlor table, a match burned and placed carefully on the mantel. I didn't know why, only that it felt right, as if I was asking permission to stay. The disturbances weren't aggressive. They didn't slam doors or shout. They whispered, they nudged. They reminded you that you weren't alone, not truly. And the longer I stayed, the more I felt like the house was watching, learning me, not in a threatening way, just aware. There was a rhythm to the nights, a pattern. The wind would hush, the floorboards would creak at a certain hour, the lights would dim, and the distant clock, never the grandfather, would chime 13 times, always 13. I stopped checking after a week. The atmosphere grew heavier but not hostile. The dread wasn't sharp, it was slow, like water rising around your ankles. You didn't panic, you just noticed. Every night, I'd sit in the small wooden chair by my window, looking out into the fog. And every night, the same thought crept into my mind. Something was going to happen, not soon, not with noise, but eventually, and the house would be ready. It began with a hum, barely audible, like the murmur of a distant conversation behind a closed door. I'd grown used to the whispers, the creaks, the scent of old wood and candle wax that clung to every corner of Thibodeau Funeral Home. But this hum was new, not menacing, not inviting. Just there, persistent and soft, as if calling from somewhere it shouldn't have. It was a rainy afternoon, unusually grey for Louisiana. Clouds hung low, and the droplets on the windows blurred the outside world into smears of motionless grey. Evelyn had gone to town for supplies, something she rarely did, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I was alone in the house during the day. I wasn't doing anything unusual, just sweeping the back corridor near the storage rooms, humming absent-mindedly, when I noticed a draft, a soft, cool breeze brushing against my ankle. I stopped and looked around. No open windows, no vents. Just an old wooden door at the end of the hall, one I'd passed a dozen times but never truly noticed. It blended into the wall too well, almost like it didn't want to be seen. There was no knob, just a brass handle, dull with age. The hum grew louder as I approached, vibrating faintly through the floor. I touched the handle, cold, much colder than the rest of the house. The door creaked open, slow and reluctant, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward. I stared for a long moment, no lights, no railing. Just stone steps slick with age, and darkness curling below like a coiled snake. Something told me to walk away. I didn't. I descended slowly, my phone flashlight cutting a pale beam through the musty dark. The air grew cooler, and the scent changed. Less dust, more earth, like old roots and wet stone. The walls were close, built of uneven stone, and the deeper I went, the more I felt the pressure of silence. Not just the absence of sound, but a presence in the quiet, like something was holding its breath. At the bottom, the stairway opened into a small chamber. I expected dust, cobwebs, maybe forgotten tools. What I found instead was an altar. A raised stone slab covered in a cloth faded to near grey. Atop it sat a small wooden chest, no bigger than a shoebox, bound with rusted metal bands and a simple lock, long corroded and snapped open. Around the room were symbols carved into the stone, circles within circles, jagged lines intersecting, like cracked glass. Some looked familiar in a way I couldn't explain, like echoes of shapes I'd seen in dreams. One symbol was repeated on the chest itself, 3 vertical slashes inside a crescent moon. I stepped closer. The hum had stopped. I opened the chest. Inside, wrapped in brittle parchment, was a journal. Its leather cover was cracked, the edges curled with age. I lifted it gently. The pages crackled as I turned them, each one filled with small, spidery handwriting. Dates ran back nearly a century. The ink had faded to a dull brown, but the words were legible, barely. The entries weren't normal. They didn't talk about people or burials or life in the town. They spoke of the cycles and the veil and the one who waits. Over and over that phrase appeared. The one who waits. Sometimes alone, sometimes as part of a sentence that ended in a sharp, hurried scrawl, as if the writer had stopped mid-thought. One entry stood out more than the others. She said he only comes when the silence is deepest, when no wind blows and no clocks tick. That is when he listens. That is when he chooses. He marks the one who lingers too long. I have heard the knock. I will not open the door. My breath caught. The words echoed something I'd read weeks ago. On the envelope Evelyn gave me. I flipped further. There were sketches, crude drawings of the house, of faces half erased, and of symbols like the ones etched into the walls. One was a floor plan of the funeral home with a section circled in red, marked, "Do not disturb the below." I looked up. The altar, the room. This was the below. Something moved behind me. I turned sharply, just the shadows shifting, but it felt like a breath, warm against my neck. I backed away, clutching the journal to my chest, and returned to the stairwell. As I climbed, the air seemed thicker. The light at the top was dimmer. And when I reached the hall again, the door I'd entered through was gone, just smooth wood paneling. I stumbled back, heart pounding. I pressed my hand to where the door had been, solid, seamless. I blinked, tried again, still nothing. I rushed to my room, journal in hand, and locked the door behind me. My hands were shaking, my palms cold. I sat on the bed and opened the journal, again rereading the final entries. Some pages had been torn out. I searched for anything, any clue, any explanation. But all I found were names. Dozens of names, handwritten and underlined. Some had been crossed out, others circled. One name stood alone on the last page, underlined twice. Mine, not just my first name, my full name, spelled perfectly, written, in ink darker than the rest. I didn't remember writing it. That night I dreamt of the room beneath the house, of stone walls breathing, of eyes opening in the dark. And a voice, not loud, not angry, just patient, whispering from behind the closed door, "Stay long enough and I'll show you what waits." When I woke, the journal was gone. In its place, on the small desk beside the lamp, was a single page. One word, written in neat, familiar ink. Soon. The silence became a presence. Not just an absence of sound, but something that lingered in every room, alive, heavy, like a breath held just behind the walls. After the journal vanished and the hidden door sealed behind me, the house seemed to shift its behavior, subtly at first, as if testing the limits of my attention. But it didn't take long before the funeral home no longer felt like a quiet relic of the past. It felt like a mind, thinking, remembering, watching. It started with the knocks, 3, soft, at the end of the hall. Always around 3:12 a.m., always faint, like knuckles brushing against the wood rather than striking it. The first time I sat up in bed, heart frozen, listening. I thought maybe it was Evelyn, but she never moved through the house after dark. I waited. Nothing. No footsteps. No voice. The next night, it happened again. Same time. Same sound. But this time, it was closer. By the 5th night, the knocks were outside my door. I didn't open it. The lights began to flicker more often. No longer in soft pulses, but sharp, erratic bursts, flashing once and going dark, only to blink back on. Moments later, the bulbs in the hallway buzzed constantly, casting shadows that seemed to tremble along the walls. One bulb above the main stairway shattered just as I walked beneath it, sending shards tinkling to the floor like glass rain. When I looked up, I saw nothing, no wire, no cause. Just the empty socket swaying ever so slightly. In the chapel, the wooden pews would creak under invisible weight. I'd walk in, duster in hand, and hear the faint shift of weight. Someone sitting, someone standing, someone moving quietly from row to row. But I was always alone. I counted the pews more than once, as if expecting one to vanish or multiply. The grandfather clock in the parlor, once slow, had stopped completely. Not at midnight, not at noon, but at 3:12, every time I reset it, it returned to that moment. 3:12, the exact time of the knocks, and then came the scraping. At first, it was high-pitched and distant like nails on slate. Sometimes in the walls, sometimes under the floorboards. It didn't follow a pattern, it was random, erratic, but it always stopped the moment I tried to trace it. One night, I heard it just outside the bathroom door. I stood there, hand frozen, on the knob, listening to it drag across the wood, then silence, and a breath low and warm on the back of my neck. I spun around. No one. The mirrors turned unreliable. Reflections would lag. I'd walk past and see myself still standing, or I'd glance over my shoulder and see someone behind me, only to turn and find emptiness. Once, I caught a glimpse of Evelyn in the hallway mirror. She was staring straight. at me, but when I turned around, she wasn't there. Later that day, I asked her if she'd been upstairs. "I don't leave the study anymore," she said softly, pouring tea with her usual precision. "Not since they started moving the furniture." I didn't ask what she meant. The furniture had begun shifting, a chair slightly off angle. The dining table moved an inch to the left. The rug in the viewing room rolled back at the corner, as if someone had stepped on it and forgotten to fix it. I corrected everything daily, and every morning it would return, slightly more displaced. It was subtle, deliberate, like a silent conversation unfolding between me and something unseen. One night, I lit a fire in the small hearth in my room. The air had grown colder, biting even through the thick stone walls. As I sat watching the flames, wrapped in a blanket, I felt a breeze, sharp and chilling, sweep across the room. The window was shut. I checked twice, but the flame bent sharply, nearly extinguished, then returned, over and over, like something breathing on it. Contrasts became more pronounced, the warmth of the fire against the sudden chill, the soft glow of a candle flickering violently as if caught in a storm. Long silences stretched out, and when sound did return, it was faint and sudden, a whisper, a single footstep, a click of the door latch. Enough to jolt the stillness, but never enough to explain. Sleep became fragmented. I'd wake gasping, drenched in sweat, heart racing with no memory of the dream, just the lingering feeling of being watched, of being near something that did not want me to wake. One evening, while dusting the shelves in the study, I found a second journal. This one was hidden behind a row of untouched books, smaller than the first, bound in green leather. The pages were fresher, written in a cleaner hand. They belonged to someone named Joseph Thibodeau, Evelyn's son, I presumed. The entries were dated 15 years ago. They said he chose me, that I would see what others could not. I thought they meant visions, but it's worse. It's not what I see, it's what sees me. Mother won't speak of it. She burns the candles and leaves bowls of salt, but it watches her too. I've seen it behind her reflection. I hear it at night, dragging something heavy across the attic floor. We don't have an attic. The last entry was a single line. "He is at the door. I made the mistake once. I will not open it again." I looked up, pulse roaring in my ears. The room felt smaller, heavier. I turned toward the hallway and saw for a moment the silhouette of a man, tall, still, waiting. I blinked. Gone. Evelyn didn't speak much after that. She walked slower. Her eyes stayed on the floor. Once, I found her in the chapel, standing in front of the altar, her lips moving silently. When I approached, she whispered, "He's closer now. He knows you've been reading." I didn't open the door, I said almost defensively. "You don't have to," she replied, still, not looking at me. "He opens it himself when the silence is deep enough." The knocks resumed that night. 3, soft, deliberate, then again, and again. Every night. Until the sound no longer frightened me, it unsettled me in a different way, like it wasn't asking for permission, but reminding me that it didn't need any. I placed salt along the windowsills. I lit candles in every corner. I whispered the name Joseph as if calling for help, but nothing stopped the changes. The wind outside the house no longer rustled the trees. It circled the house, whispering unintelligible things through the eaves. The clocks no longer ticked, even the new ones. They all froze at 3:12. The phones stopped working. My messages to the outside world unsent. No signal, no line. Evelyn stayed in her study, refusing to eat. She left me a note one morning. "He's almost through. When he comes, don't speak, don't run, just listen." The next evening, I found her room empty, her shoes still by the bed. Her teacup, warm. Her scent, lavender and old paper, lingering. Just long enough to say goodbye. I now walk the halls alone. The light flickers when I pass. The pews creak in rhythm with my steps. The mirror doesn't reflect me anymore. And the knocks? They're inside now. But I haven't opened the door. Not yet. I used to think silence was comforting, that it meant peace, rest, solitude, but not here, not anymore. Silence in Thibodeau Funeral Home had become something else entirely, something intelligent. A breathing stillness that waited, that listened, and now it had started speaking back. It began 2 nights after Evelyn vanished. I'd walked the halls as usual, checking locks, relighting candles. The air was thick, and the house unusually warm, like it was holding its breath in anticipation. I reached the end of the west corridor, where the hallway branches toward the viewing room, and froze. There, in the narrow beam of candlelight, stood a figure, still, silent, facing the wall. At first I thought it was Evelyn. The posture seemed familiar, the shoulders slightly hunched, hands at her sides. But when I stepped forward, the figure didn't move. I called out, quietly, like the house had taught me to, but got no reply. I took another step. My shadow stretched across the floor, nearly touching hers. The candle flickered once, twice, then the figure turned. There was no face, just skin, smooth and pale, stretched tight over the front of the head like a canvas that had never been painted. I gasped and stumbled back, the candle clattering to the ground and snuffing out in an instant. When I struck a match seconds later, the hallway was empty. I spent that night sitting on the chapel floor, surrounded by lit candles and old hymnals. The creak of footsteps echoed above me. Slow, careful, pacing back and forth just above the ceiling. I stared up, heart beating in time with the flicker of the flames, trying to remember if there had ever been a room above the chapel. The next morning, I found it. It shouldn't have been there. A door I'd never seen before, tucked behind the grandfather clock that hadn't worked in weeks. I pushed the clock aside, though it was far heavier than it should have been, and found a narrow passage, no windows, no dust, just stairs. The air was colder up there, like the house forgot how to hold warmth. At the top of the stairs, I found the room, square, small, and completely unfamiliar. In the center was a single chair facing a window. The light filtering through was grey and unfocused, like fog trapped inside the glass. On the wall beside the chair was a photo, framed in black wood covered in dust. I wiped it clean. It was me, standing outside the funeral home, smiling. Only, I'd never taken that photo, never posed like that, never worn that particular coat. The one with the tear on the right sleeve, the tear that hadn't been there yesterday, but was now. I backed out slowly, keeping my eyes on the frame as if it might move. I closed the door and slid the clock back into place. I didn't tell anyone. There was no one left to tell. That was when I began hearing my name, first in the distance. A soft, breathy murmur just as I was falling asleep, then clearer, closer, spoken not with anger or malice, but with familiarity, as if the house had grown used to me, as if it wanted me to listen. Thomas. That was the first time I heard it clearly. I sat bolt upright in bed. My room was dark, the window was open, though I hadn't touched it in days. The curtains swayed gently, letting in the cold night air. The sound had come from the hallway. I didn't move. Then I heard it again. Thomas. A whisper. Not urgent. Not afraid. Just there, calling. I didn't sleep that night. In the days that followed, the house changed faster. The fog outside never lifted. The clocks all stopped completely. Candles melted faster, their flames flickering wildly, as if reacting to a breeze that never touched the skin. I started losing time. I'd sit down to write, only to glance at the clock and find 3 hours missing. I'd enter a room and forget why. Sometimes I'd look in the mirror and feel disconnected, like the reflection was a second too slow. Like it blinked just after I did. I began hearing things when I wasn't alone. Footsteps behind me, heavy breathing in the room. Once, as I stood in the dining hall lighting the wall sconces, a hand touched my back, gently, as if reassuring me. I spun around, empty. The figure returned on the fourth night, not just in the hallway this time, but in the chapel, standing at the pulpit, head bowed, motionless. I stayed hidden in the doorway, barely breathing, and as I watched, it slowly raised its hand and pointed toward the back pew. I turned and saw myself, sitting alone, eyes wide, mouth open, staring. I shut the door and ran. That was the first time I truly felt fear, not dread, not discomfort, but true, overwhelming fear. I began boarding rooms shut, hammering nails into the doors, stacking furniture against entrances, sealing cracks with salt and wax. It didn't help. Every morning the boards were still there, but the doors were open again. My room began to change, subtly. The wallpaper peeled on its own. The ceiling developed a crack shaped like a spiral. The window no longer showed the outside world, just fog and shadows. The photo of me reappeared, this time taped to the inside of my closet. Same pose, same smile. But this time, behind me in the picture, stood the faceless figure. I burned it. The flame hissed like it was in pain, and the next morning, the photo was back, slightly burned, still smiling. I began talking to myself, not out of madness, but because silence had become unbearable. I recited poems, hymns, grocery lists, anything to keep the quiet at bay. I couldn't tell anymore if I was talking to the house, or if it was finally talking back. My paranoia turned to desperation. I dug through every book in the house, every drawer, searching for answers. I found more journals, some in languages I didn't know, some in symbols, some with pages missing. Each hinted at the same thing. He chooses those who linger. He mimics what he sees. He waits behind the skin. I found Joseph's name again, etched into the underside of a wooden desk. A message scratched next to it. He took my face. I started. Covering the mirrors, too many times I caught glimpses of my reflection blinking wrong or smiling when I wasn't. And yet, there was still part of me that wanted to understand, that wanted to see what the house was trying to show me. It was no longer hiding its secrets. It was offering them. And maybe I wanted to accept. That's what scared me most. One night, just before dawn, I stood in the main hallway, every candle in the house lit behind me. And I called out, "I know you're here." The floor creaked. I turned slowly. There it was, not the faceless figure this time, but me, perfectly me, same eyes, same clothes, same voice when it spoke. "Come back inside," it said. "It's cold. Out here." I didn't answer. It smiled and walked away. I haven't seen it since, but I can feel it right beneath the surface, like a second skin, waiting. And I don't know if I'll be strong enough not to wear it. The rain hadn't stopped in days. Not a storm, not thunder, just a steady, patient drizzle that whispered against the roof like a lullaby for the dead. The skies above the funeral home were an endless smear of grey, and the trees outside barely moved, like even the wind had given up trying to pass through. Inside, time had unraveled. I couldn't tell how many days had gone by. Clocks had lost their meaning. The sun never fully rose, and the nights had begun to breathe. I'd stopped sleeping, not out of fear, but because something inside me wouldn't allow it anymore. I felt watched even in dreams, and the worst part, I wasn't sure I was the only me walking these halls anymore. The final truth began to unfold, not with thunder, not with screams, but with a whisper. It came from the walls. Not a single voice, but many, woven together like the house itself, had begun to murmur. "We've been waiting." At first I ignored it, assumed it was memory, exhaustion, madness. But the whispers grew clearer, coalescing into words that filled the spaces between my thoughts. This is not a home. It's a vessel. The realization struck like a slow-moving tide. Not a sharp blow, just a quiet weight pressing into my chest. A vessel, not for bodies, for souls. I remembered Evelyn's words. We walked gently among them. She hadn't meant the dead. She had meant them, the echoes, the things that lingered. The watchers in the mirrors, the footsteps in the silence, the eyes behind the walls. Thibodeau Funeral Home wasn't haunted. It was alive, not in the way flesh is alive, but in the way a wound breathes before it bleeds. The house didn't trap spirits. It absorbed them. Every whisper I'd heard, every cold touch, every flickering candle, it wasn't meant to scare me. It was part of the cycle, an invitation, a preparation. The house didn't want fear. It wanted understanding. It wanted surrender. The journals made sense now. Joseph hadn't gone mad. He had been chosen, just like I had. The figure with no face, it wasn't a ghost. It was a reflection, a shell. And slowly, it was becoming me. That night, I returned to the hidden room above the chapel, the room that shouldn't exist. I brought salt, candles, and the torn pages I'd found in Joseph's desk. I arranged them in a circle, sat in the chair, and waited. The fog outside thickened, pressing against the glass like hands longing to get in. And then, I saw him. Joseph. Not in flesh, not in shadow, but in reflection. He stood behind me in the window, not the faceless thing, but the real man, younger than I expected, eyes heavy, shoulders tired. He didn't speak with his mouth. The words came like memory. The house is hungry, Thomas, but it doesn't eat like we do. It takes what you forget, who you were, then it makes you into something new. It gives you back, changed. It doesn't want us dead, it wants us willing. And once we stop fighting, once we accept what waits in the silence, we become part of it. I asked him the question that had gnawed at my ribs like bone-deep hunger. What is it? His reflection smiled, sad, gentle. He is not a man, he is not a ghost. He is the moment you let go of yourself, the shape you make when you stop being. Afraid of the dark, the one who waits is not coming. He's already here, and then he was gone. Just me, my own pale face in the window, my own breath fogging the glass. The house creaked, not like wood shifting, but like lungs exhaling. I left the room quietly. The house didn't resist. The hallway felt softer now, less oppressive, as if it was relieved, like it knew I'd seen the truth and wasn't running from it anymore. In the chapel, the candles flickered in unison. In the mirror, I watched my reflection tilt its head slightly faster than I did, and I didn't flinch, because I knew. This place wasn't evil. It wasn't haunted by accident or cursed by ritual. It was created deliberately by people like Evelyn, like Joseph. People who understood that the world has rooms where reality thins, and something older waits just beyond the veil. They hadn't built a funeral home. They built a gateway, a passage for those who were ready to see past death, to step into the in-between, to become what watches from the dark. And now it was my turn. I walked to Evelyn's study. Her journal was waiting on the desk. The pages turned from me, stopping on an entry dated only days before she vanished. I see him in the mirrors now. Not the man, not the boy, but the one he'll become. I thought I had more time. He's listening now. The house has chosen. If he accepts, it will be his. If he refuses, he will disappear, like the rest. We all disappear, but not all of us return. The air in the room felt different, like it knew this chapter was closing. The hallway outside seemed longer than before, the shadows deeper, but they didn't frighten me. They welcomed me. They made space. I stood at the end of the corridor facing the viewing room. The door was open, not wide, just a crack, enough for sound to pass through. I stepped closer. A floorboard creaked behind me. I turned. No one, but I felt it. The presence. Not malicious, not vengeful, just watching, waiting. Inside the viewing room, everything was exactly as it should be. Flowers faded, candles melted. The table where loved ones would normally kneel stood empty, except for one object, a mirror, tall, oval, framed in black wood. I hadn't seen it before. I was sure it hadn't been there. I approached slowly, breath steady, eyes focused. In the glass I saw myself, but not exactly. This version of me was calm, eyes darker, skin paler, expression peaceful. And behind him, just beyond the reflection, stood a figure draped in shadow, not the faceless one, not a copy, something older, something real. He didn't speak, but I heard him. You've seen what you are. You've seen what waits. Will you stay? And for the first time since the whispers began, I answered without fear. Yes. The candles extinguished all at once. The mirror rippled like water disturbed by a single drop, and everything went silent. Not empty, complete. In that moment, I didn't vanish. I changed. I didn't become a ghost. I didn't fade into shadow. I became the one who watches, the one who waits. The funeral home still stands. Visitors still come. They hear the creaks. They see the flickers. They feel the cold. And sometimes, only sometimes, they see a man in the mirror, eyes steady, face calm, watching, waiting for the next soul to stop running. The fog had never lifted, even after I accepted the truth, even after I became part of whatever it was the house held so close. It remained, blanketing the world beyond the windows like a curtain that refused to rise. The sky, the trees, the road outside, they no longer mattered. Not here. Thibodeau Funeral Home had slipped from time, from place. It was a destination now. Not on any map, not on any GPS, but for those meant to find it, it always appeared, and someone always does. It was nearly morning when the bell above the front door chimed, a brittle, echoing sound that hadn't rung since the day I first stepped foot inside. I knew it before I heard it, felt it in the walls, in the steady pulse beneath the floor. The house stirred. The candles flickered in unison. The mirrors fogged from the inside out. The air whispered again. He had arrived. I stood in the corridor as the front door creaked open. Fog spilled inside, trailing behind a man in his late 20s, soaked to the bone, wearing a worn-out flannel shirt and dragging a duffel bag behind. Him, he looked lost, exhausted, hollow. I knew that look. He glanced around, uncertain. "Is this Thibodeau?" he asked, his voice hoarse from cold and confusion. I didn't speak. I simply nodded. He smiled a little, relieved. "I saw the job posting online," he said. "Caretaker, nights only. Said lodging was provided." Of course it did. The house always knew what they were looking for. I led him to the guest room, the same one I'd stayed in. It looked different now, tidier, untouched, like it had never been used. The lamp on the side table already glowed, humming quietly. A fresh envelope sat on the desk, his name handwritten on the front. He didn't notice me linger, didn't ask why I didn't stay. That's how it starts. That's how it always starts. I left him alone, closing the door softly behind me. As I walked away, I heard the gentle rip of paper, the envelope opening. The house signed, content, anticipating. But something had shifted. For weeks, maybe months, maybe years, I'd wandered the halls as a silent observer, becoming more shadow than man. I had watched, listened, waited, not out of obedience, but out of instinct. Because once you give yourself to the house, it becomes part of you, and you part of it. Yet something inside me still pulsed with a rhythm I couldn't quite name. A heartbeat that wasn't entirely the house's. A breath that still carried my own scent. I hadn't disappeared completely. Not yet. That was when I remembered the attic, or rather, created the memory of it, because it had never been there before. No stairs, no hatch, and yet I saw it clearly now, just above the chapel, just behind. The pulpit. As if I had finally unlocked the last piece of the house of mind, I followed the hallway back through corridors I'd long stopped naming. At the far end, past a door I'd never noticed because it hadn't wanted me to, I found a staircase that curled upward like a spiral of bone. The attic was waiting. Dust floated like snowflakes in the stair layer, undisturbed for decades, or seconds. Time was no longer something I trusted. The walls were lined with boxes, wooden, unlabeled, sealed. The floor creaked beneath my feet with every careful step. And in the center of the room stood a mirror, not tall like the others. This one was wide, almost like a window, and on the other side I saw Evelyn. She wasn't old anymore. She stood as a woman in her 30s, wearing a dark dress and gloves. Her silver hair turned to soft black curls. She smiled. "Did you think it would end?" she asked. "I thought I had accepted it," I replied. "You did, but not completely." Then, "What am I now?" She stepped closer on the other side of the mirror, though her feet made no sound. "You are the moment before surrender." The mirror rippled again. The surface distorted, then settled, and I understood. The house didn't feed on fear. It transformed it, took those who ran from themselves, those fractured by guilt, sorrow, regret, and showed them who they really were beneath the skin. It didn't demand anything. It waited for them to choose. But what if someone didn't choose? What if someone interrupted the cycle? I turned from the mirror, breathing heavily, the attic spinning around me. The house pushed against my thoughts, uncomfortable now, nervous, because it knew. I remembered the first night, the whisper in the mirror, the knocks, the shifting reflection. The figure had never wanted to replace me. It had wanted me to become it. But what if I refused now? What if I stopped playing the role? I raced back downstairs, faster than I'd ever moved in the house. The walls pressed tighter, the air thickening like molasses. Paintings blinked as I passed. The floor walked under my feet. The new man, his door was closed. I banged once. "Don't open the envelope," I shouted. No reply. "Listen to me, please, it's not a job." I pushed the door open. The room was empty, the bed untouched. The lamp of the envelope gone. I turned slowly, and there he stood, not in the hallway, but inside the mirror behind me. Smiling, not confused. Anymore. Not hollow. Complete. Because the cycle had already begun. It was too late, but that's when I realized something else. The real twist. The cruel brilliance of the house. There was never just one. There had always been two. The chosen. And the guide, Joseph, was Evelyn's reflection. It was Joseph's. Now he would be mine. The house didn't trap us. It made us mirrors. Each one becoming a reflection for the next. Each one learning to smile a little too perfectly. Each one learning how to welcome. So I stood still. Let the walls settle. Let the wind return. And I smiled. Because the house didn't need to hunt. It only needed to wait. And somewhere in the fog, a new traveler is already on the way.